I'm Sam McKeag, and this is Saskatchewan. Elon Musk is one of the most polarizing people on the planet. The tech billionaire was born in South Africa and lives in the United States, but his family spent many formative years in our Prairie province. It led to Musk getting Canadian citizenship, but some Canadians want it revoked. There's actually a petition about it. The reason? Because of his attempts to, quote, attack Canadian sovereignty. In response to that petition, Musk tweeted, "Canada is not a real country." It even led to a back and forth with then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau over X. All of this prompted the CBC's Jeff Leo to take a deeper look at Musk's Canadian roots, and they go deep in Saskatchewan. Many people here already know that Musk's mom, May, was born in Regina in 1948. But Jeff started looking into her dad, Elon's grandpa. He was actually a pretty big deal in the province about 80 years ago. Just like Musk, he was very involved in politics. He tangled with Canadian prime ministers, and he got into fights about Canadian sovereignty. Jeff spent months combing through the archives and talking to people all over the world. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jeff, where does one start?
Yeah, so I got started on this late last year because some colleagues of mine back east in Toronto were working on a story about Elon Musk just because of the incredible power that he had, given all the power he'd been given by newly elected President Donald Trump. So my colleagues were looking into Musk's Canadian roots specifically. They asked me for my help because they knew he was from here. And I mean, I knew that. We knew that, right? Musk's mom was from Regina, but I didn't know much else. So I started digging around in old newspaper archives, and I was shocked by what a big deal Musk's grandpa was here in Saskatchewan, especially in the 1940s. So in that decade, I looked at the Regina Leader-Post and found, from 1940 to 1950, he was mentioned no fewer than 500 times in the Regina Leader-Post. So, he got a lot of attention. He ran political parties here, ran in elections against some famous Canadians folks might have heard of, guys like Tommy Douglas, John Diefenbaker, William Lyon Mackenzie King. And so I decided to take a look into Elon Musk's grandpa, Joshua Haldeman, and found a pretty remarkable life.
So, she asks while stroking her chin,
right.
Who is Joshua Haldeman?
Yes, so we need to rewind the clock a fair bit back to 1902, where he was born in a log cabin in a small town in Minnesota. And then not long after that, he and his family moved to Saskatchewan, to a small town near Swift Current, a community by the name of Waldeck. And he was raised as a prairie boy on a farm here in Saskatchewan, involved in wrestling and boxing and horseback riding, and also exhibition rope spinning. Which you can actually see a picture of this. So in our story, if you go online, you'll see a picture of Elon Musk's grandpa, who looks, I mean, you've seen this, a lot like Elon Musk. It's pretty wild. So anyhow, in the early 1920s, when he grew up a little bit, he went off to chiropractic school in the U.S., and he was following in his mom's footsteps, Almeida, who was apparently Canada's very first chiropractor. Yeah. So, but when he graduated, instead of going into chiropractic, he decided to take up farming initially. And so this was in the late 1920s, which it turns out, if you know your history, was not a super good time to get into farming.
No, because late 1920s, early 1930s, Dust Bowl hits, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the Great Depression. This is stock market crash that was prompted by massive tariffs. And there was the Prairie Dust Bowl that extended throughout the 1930s. And it led to a horror show here in Saskatchewan. People were losing their farms. 2/3 of Saskatchewan people were on social assistance. People were dying of starvation and scurvy and rickets. And so I reached out to Elon Musk's grandpa, or rather father, about this, Errol Musk, who lives in South Africa. and to ask him, his own recollections about talking with Joshua Haldeman, who was his father-in-law. And Errol Musk said that for Haldeman, the problem, the experience of the Great Depression was horrible, but he thought there was much more behind it than just bad weather. I reached out to Elon Musk's grandpa, or rather father, about this, Errol Musk, who lives in South Africa, and to ask him, his own recollections about talking with Joshua Haldeman, who was his father-in-law. And Errol Musk said that for Haldeman, the problem, the experience of the Great Depression was horrible, but he thought there was much more behind it than just bad weather.
For example, milk is rotting on one station, going sour and being ruined because the farmers get it to the station during the Depression, and there's no train to take it to the people who want to buy it for their food, and things like that. He pointed out to me about how the Depression was sort of man-made. In other words, it was planned or something. And he was very much onto that sort of thing. That there's a plan to, screw up the world in favor of certain people.
So if I'm hearing this correctly,
Yeah.
He thought there was some kind of conspiracy behind the Great Depression.
Yeah, so we know from Haldeman's writings that he believed that there was a global communist conspiracy that was controlling everything, the banks, the media, the universities, even to healthcare. So he thought the conspiracy was so widespread that it was behind the government-mandated vaccinations. It was behind the fluoridation of water. It was behind the pasteurization of milk. He thought all these things were designed to, assert control on the population and weaken the population. He talked about this in a book that he wrote, The International Conspiracy in Health. Quote from that book, he says, "The invisible government working to carry out the objectives of the international conspiracy is operating in every country." And he also wrote, "Only by following the example and guidance of Jesus Christ will man be able to successfully combat the evil forces of the international conspiracy and achieve greatness for himself and for his country." And so he, dedicated his own life to fighting this international conspiracy.
So a lot of those issues, a lot of that language sounds like the sort of conversations that are happening today.
Yeah, for sure. The distrust, the conspiracy theories. You think about the pandemic we just came through that's been referred to as a plandemic, right? It's also a government plot of some sort. And so it is pretty striking. I talked to a fellow by the name of Kevin Anderson about this. So he's a history professor at the University of Calgary. He's studied and written books about conspiracy theories on the prairies in and around that time. And he said, Joshua Haldeman's comments are quite striking.
You could read what you just read to me about Haldeman, or I could read it in class, and I would say, when do you think this was written? And I bet you the more aware students would say, 2 years ago, this year.
Anderson says the tendency to look to conspiracies to explain what was going on at that time was perfectly understandable. He said, people had been overwhelmed by all of these world forces that were well beyond their control. The stock market crash, the Dust Bowl, the lingering effects of World War I. And interestingly, immigration as well. There had been mass immigration here to Saskatchewan. And he said, so people were understandably rattled by this world that was changing all around them.
Saskatchewan grows more than any other part of the country at that time. Immigration to Saskatchewan, it is totally altering of that province forever. And most of that immigration is Central or Southern or Eastern Europe. I can't believe someone growing up in a Saskatchewan of a certain era wouldn't have been impacted by global forces that feel completely out of everybody's control. And they're right. That's the other thing. It's not a total crazy idea, right? That why can't I figure any of this out? Why am I working hard and losing? Why? That's a good question.
So Haldeman believes in this conspiracy idea.
Yep.
What does he do about it?
Well, he dedicates his life to exposing it, and that's why he got involved in politics. He started getting involved with the CCF, which is the forerunner of the NDP here in Saskatchewan. Now, this was a party founded in the 1930s, founded on the principle of getting rid of capitalism and establishing a socialist state. And so he was connected to this party for a while, even took on leadership roles. But eventually there was a shift in his thinking in and around 1936. That's when he moved to Regina. He set up his chiropractic office here. And he joined up with a new movement called Technocracy Inc. So this was being led by this very charismatic fellow from New York. His name was Howard Scott, this 6'5" man with a very magnetic personality. He was an engineer. And his basic idea was the government should be run by experts, by engineers and scientists, and not by politicians. Politicians were morons. They were idiots, and we needed to run the government based on by experts. And so what he said was he was noticing that, technology had developed so fast and was developing so fast that it was no longer necessary for everyone to work as long and as hard as they were. And if we could just get, the incompetent politicians out of the way, the experts could figure it out. And here's an interview with Howard Scott from 1958 where he talks about some of his ideas.
We call it technocracy in contradistinction to autocracy, the rule of one, and plutocracy, the rule of wealth, and democracy, supposedly the rule of the many. Technocracy would be the rule of science. There's no future in work. You're beginning to find it out, but you still do not want to admit it. That's from that old moral cliche of centuries back that the devil would find evil for idle hands to do. So you still believe in the nonsense of working for a living. And yet technology is displacing more and more of you all the time.
That's wild when you consider AI and its place in the world right now.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so a government run by experts, not politicians. How would that work?
So he wasn't super clear on kind of how the society would have to change in order to get there. You did hear he was not a big fan of democracy. But what he said was, when technology advanced, again, fewer people would need to work. So in his vision, in a technocratic society, people would only work between the ages of 25 and 45. So you'd start later and you're retired.
I'd be almost retired.
That's right.
You would be retired.
I would have been long retired. Exactly. Working, and those people would only work 4 hours a day, 4 days a week. And he says that would be enough, to run society. And Haldeman bought into this view. He became a leader in technocracy, led the Regina branch, wrote an article about it, saying that society was about to face a major smash up and technocracy would be there to pick up the pieces. He wrote, "No other country has anything that the North American people either want or require," adding that it's possible to build this new order of mankind, this new America, right here and now.
So very much pushing for a North America only solution.
Yeah, so technocracy did have an isolationist bent. And not long into World War II, the federal government became concerned about this movement and actually declared that technocracy was illegal. That happened in 1940.
That's quite the move.
Yeah.
So what did Haldeman do about it?
So within weeks of that declaration, he placed an ad in the Regina Leader-Post defending technocracy, saying the government was making a big mistake by declaring it illegal. And a few months after that, he was paid a visit by the RCMP, and he was arrested and charged with stirring up disloyalty, specifically related to placing that ad. So he eventually left technocracy, and had a bit of a change of heart about the whole movement. Not exactly clear, everything that changed his mind, but he ended up calling technocracy a scientific Frankenstein.
So from loving it to hating it.
Yeah.
Pretty harsh transition there.
Yeah.
What was his concern?
So he says that in 1940, the technocracy took a radical shift, and they started pushing for the United States to take over Canada and Greenland and other parts of the United States by purchasing it or by negotiating for it or by force of arms. In other words, military action against Canada and Greenland. So this was in 1940. And he warned Canada about this, and he was standing up for Canadian sovereignty, for British sovereignty, saying, we need to do something about this. This movement's a problem.
So we're 80 years later, but Jeff, where have I heard this?
Yes.
Concerns about sovereignty of Canada and Greenland?
I know.
She asks tongue-in-cheek.
Well, I mean, honestly, many of the things in doing this, the research for this story, the cyclical nature of history and so many of the things that I'm reading feel like echoes of the stuff we're going through right now. So Haldeman ended up leaving technocracy, and he ended up joining a movement called Social Credit. So this was a party that was advocating for lower taxes and less government regulation and free markets and Christian social values. So sounding much more like more of a standard sort of conservative right-wing political party at that time. And Haldeman became a leader.
Of course he did.
In Social Credit. Well, this was his pattern.
He likes to be in charge.
He joined something and then he ended up leading it. And he ran the provincial party, so the Social Credit Party of Saskatchewan, for years. He also became the chairman of the National Party. So he had power, right across the country. In and around that time, he decided to purchase a plane and take flying lessons. And it was part of the thinking was he was running his chiropractic business at the time. He was also taking a leadership role in kind of moving chiropractic practice forward in Canada. So he's doing a lot of that, and then his politics and family. So he wanted to make himself more efficient. So he took up flying. And the family came to be called the Flying Haldemans because he would take his kids with him sometimes. And so they were the Flying Haldemans.
It sounds like a circus act, I'm just saying.
The Flying
It sounds like a circus act, I'm just saying.
So in 1948, he ran against Tommy Douglas and the NDP. And there are newspaper ads. You can see them if you go to our story, where it said, make him your premier, right? Make Elon Musk's grandpa your premier, the premier of Saskatchewan. He also ran for the Federal Social Credit Party. In one election, he ran against Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King.
That's a notable name.
Yeah, that was in a Prince Albert riding. And then he ran here in Regina against John Diefenbaker, and that was just a few years before John Diefenbaker went on to become prime minister. So he was like rubbing shoulders with, some Canadian royalty, right?
Very close to people of influence.
Yes. Yeah, it's quite something.
So what happened with those connections? How did he do?
So, his party didn't do super well in the polls.
That's why we don't know his name and we know the others, I suppose.
Exactly. Social Credit did very well in Alberta and became the government and was the government for about 40 years under Ernest Manning. But here it didn't really catch on. But he was certainly, active in promoting its views. Now, according to a paper written by Haldeman's son, Scott, who is himself a chiropractor, Haldeman always blamed the banks for his experience of losing his farm. Kevin Anderson, again, the historian from University of Calgary, he studied social credit. And he told me that the movement, social credit, shared Haldeman's suspicion of the banks and his general conspiratorial view. Just like Haldeman, they talked about the conspiracy that was controlling things.
A conspiratorial reading of history, where all history, all events, everything is part of, as you said, the capital T conspiracy, capital C, which is an international conspiracy headed by Jews, almost always in these theories, in these ideas. Jewish people, or people who have become, lack of a better term, fellow travelers with this population of hidden elite, essentially. And they're trying to weaken the Christian nations of the world. However they do that, the key way they do it is through banking and control of finance, to crush people under increasing debt and desperation that they are cowed and essentially become a sort of easily controlled population.
So this concern about Jewish bankers.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so social credit did develop a reputation around that time of tending towards anti-Semitism. Its founder, there are quotes by social credit's founder referring to Jews as parasites. That sort of language is out there. While Haldeman was the chair of the National Social Credit Party, he found himself in the midst of a national scandal related to these anti-Semitic concerns. So in the social credit wing in Quebec, the organization published a document known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So this is a pretty infamous document that claims to reveal a plot by a secret wealthy group of Jewish people to take over the world. As I said, it's notorious, it's fake, it was found by courts to be fraudulent, but a social credit wing published this document, and then Haldeman was, because he's the national chair, he was the one who was fielding criticisms about all of this.
So I guess the criticisms would be, why is a wing of your party publishing this anti-Semitic document?
Yeah, exactly. And so he replied to this in a letter to the editor of the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix, and he said, so first of all, social credit's not anti-Semitic. We support all Jewish people. He said there are bad people running the banking system, but not all of them are Jewish. He said there are people other than Jews who are running the banking system. And finally, he said the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He said whether it's an authentic document or whether it's a fraudulent document, it doesn't matter, because what it shows, the words in that document, it shows what's really going on in the world. In other words, we can see that reality playing out in the world.
So he didn't condemn the Quebec wing for publishing the document then?
No, he didn't. And a Jewish rabbi from Saskatoon picked up on this. He wrote a letter to the editor himself, and he said, Dr. Haldeman's overinterest in clearing the party and himself from the charge of anti-Semitism and anti-Canadianism will not fool the people. And he added that Dr. Haldeman must have a short memory if he does not remember his own speeches shot through with anti-Semitic talk.
So it sounds like Haldeman did a lot politically, quite the political career, but he didn't really get anywhere in terms of success.
No, exactly. It was somewhat futile in terms of, no elections won, that sort of thing. But he did build quite a life. He married a young woman from Moose Jaw named Winifred. Interestingly, used to be a reporter at the Moose Jaw Times-Herald. They went on to have 5 children together, including twins, May and Kay, who were born in 1948. And of course, May would go on to become Elon Musk's mother. So the year they were born, or the year after they were born, rather, it was a big turning point in Haldeman's life. So he lost a federal election against John Diefenbaker. And right around that time, he heard a prophecy from an Anglican minister while he was at an international trade fair in Toronto.
So a prophecy, you say?
He heard a prophecy, yeah.
What does this minister say that hooks him?
So he actually talks about this in a book that he wrote while he was in South Africa. The book was called The International Conspiracy to Establish a World Government. And the book opens with this quote: "South Africa will become the leader of white civilization in the world." And he says that's the prophecy that he heard in 1949. This is from a South African man who'd lived for many years in that country. And it was that prophecy that, at least in part, was pivotal to helping Haldeman make the decision to move his family to South Africa. And this was also a pivotal time in South Africa. In 1948, the very year that Elon Musk's mom was born, that's the year that the National Party was elected to office in South Africa. And it's the party that started implementing apartheid, essentially the race policy of racial segregation in South Africa, where white people ruled.
So what do we know? I mean, I feel like we can assume, but what do we know about what he thought about apartheid, knowing that he took his whole family there?
Well, so we do have some idea. Shortly after he arrived, he was interviewed by a newspaper reporter. And he said, quote, "Instead of the government's attitude keeping me away from South Africa, it's actually encouraged me to settle here." And about a year after Haldeman moved to South Africa, he wrote an article that was published in the Regina Leader-Post. So there's a big article kind of talking about it's a letter back home saying, here's what our new life is like in South Africa. And in that, he described living arrangements and the weather. He also described how they had some hired help, several of what he called native boys and girls. And he wrote, quote, "The natives are very primitive and must not be taken seriously. We get quite a bang out of them, and they are really quite useful." But he also said it takes 3 natives to do the work of 1 white man.
Oof.
That was in the Regina Leader-Post in 1951.
Oof. Yeah. Okay. So Haldeman arrives in South Africa.
Yeah.
Does he quit politics, or does he keep trying?
So aside from his writing, I don't have any evidence that he was particularly involved in politics in South Africa. But and in terms of what keeps him busy, aside from his chiropractic work, it's a very strange story. So apparently not long after he arrived in South Africa, he read about a fellow by the name of the Great Farini. So this was William Hunt, who was a Canadian. He was a circus performer in the mid to late 1880s. And he was quite famous at the time, famous for walking on a tightrope across Niagara Falls with, say, a man on his back, or in another case, a washing machine on his back. Yeah,
I have anxiety just thinking about that, but go on.
Yeah, so a real daredevil, a real showman. He's the guy who invented and patented the human cannonball. Yeah.
I mean, someone had to do it.
Right. So later in life, William Hunt, known as the Great Farini, goes to South Africa, and he travels across the Kalahari Desert, and he claims that he found a lost city, the lost city of the Kalahari, and he actually writes a book about it. And this generates, over the next few decades, a cottage industry of amateur explorers hunting for this city. And the chief amateur explorer among them, it turns out, was Joshua Haldeman. His wife and his children, they would take regular trips into the desert looking for this city.
So Mae Musk, with her twin and her siblings and her parents, went hunting for a lost city in the desert.
That's right. That's how she spent most of her summers. They would go out into the desert, either flying or driving, and she writes about this in her book about the encounters with lions and all sorts of things. In all, Haldeman took 16 separate expeditions into the Kalahari over his lifetime, which is far more than any other explorer.
So why was he so taken with this particular search?
Well, there's really nothing specific in any of the books or articles that I read that other than just his passion for adventure. But there's nothing that actually discusses his specific reasons. But we do know that he was not operating in a vacuum. The whole lost city phenomenon, it was a craze in Africa. He was part of a large movement of white explorers looking for ancient ruins. Now, in some cases, there were real ruins out there, ancient civilizations that were quite impressive, and in some cases, imagined or rumored civilizations like the lost city of the Kalahari. So I spoke with a fellow who's studied this whole phenomenon, Herman Wittenberg. He's a professor from South Africa. He's looked into this phenomenon. He said all the researchers, even the more liberal or progressive ones, the explorers from that time, they all assumed that these great ancient civilizations could not have possibly been built by the black African population, by the indigenous people who were there.
They thought there was a whole string of these things in Southern Africa, including that Kalahari thing, which was obviously triggered by the Farini story, because Africans just basically built only with mud and thatch, grass huts. That was the idea. So this couldn't have been Bantu or African provenance.
And he said the motivation for why many of these folks were looking for, these lost cities was to give some level of legitimacy to the claims of the white people who were there, to say, we actually have a history here. White people have a history here, to give legitimacy to their claims to the land.
Yeah, at that time, there was, in a sense, this interest in legitimizing whiteness in South Africa, white civilization, and also giving it a deep historical dimension. Sort of, this is an invention of tradition, sort of a term by historians. So history was invented.
So did Joshua Haldeman and his family, the Flying Haldemans, did they ever find this lost city? Has anyone ever found this lost city?
No. And many of the researchers, most of the researchers who believed in it, have abandoned the story either as a hoax or a misunderstanding that, he thought things were ruins that weren't actually ruins. But Haldeman did believe in it to the very end. Even after Farini died, he wrote a letter to Farini's family assuring them that he still believed in the city and believed that it would be found someday. But he never did find it. And in 1974, he was out flying with his son-in-law in South Africa, and he was killed in a plane crash. He was 72 years old when he died. Elon Musk was 3 years old when he died, so he did not have a lot of time with his grandfather. The Haldeman's death was on the front page of the newspaper, and the newspaper praised him as one of the country's great explorers.